In 1995, at a remote cattle ranch in the Uinta Basin of Utah, rancher Terry Sherman and his family were checking their herd when they spotted a newborn calf just minutes old, still slick from birth, lying in the grass. The Shermans walked only a few feet away. Less than an hour had passed by, but when they returned, that calf was gone. They searched the area frantically, and then they found it. The body was there, but sadly, the calf was dead. It had been grotesquely mutilated. In broad daylight, in under 60 minutes, something had completely dissected that calf. The flesh had been peeled back with surgical precision. The organs had been removed, but the strangest part of all was that there wasn't a single drop of blood anywhere. No tracks, no predators, and no sound. Just a mutilated carcass in an open field. What could have done this so fast, so silently, and with such impossible precision? And more importantly, why here? To answer that, we need to go back to the very beginning, to the moment the Sherman family first set foot on what would become known as Skinwalker Ranch. Before we get into the story, I know it's so annoying when YouTubers ask you to like and subscribe, but honestly, it is the only way for our channels to grow. So I'd be so grateful if you could just take a second to like and subscribe to the channel. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman thought they had struck gold. After years of hard work, they'd finally saved enough to buy their dream property, a sprawling 480-acre cattle ranch tucked away in Utah's Uinta Basin. On paper, it was everything they'd ever wanted. Vast open skies, rolling pastures, plenty of room to raise their prized cattle. A chance to live in peace, away from the noise of the world. But when they stood outside their new home for the very first time, something felt off. The house itself looked ordinary enough, a modest ranch home built decades earlier. But as the Shermans explored the property, unease settled over them. Because this was no ordinary ranch house. The ranch had been left in an abandoned state by the former owners. The grass was overgrown, the property seemed to be in a state of disrepair, but as they explored further, they realised that things were worse than they seemed. Every window was reinforced with thick iron bars, the doors bristled with multiple heavy-duty locks, and inside, this was the part that really made them stop. Each room had several deadbolts, not just on the outside of the doors, but also on the inside. Why? Why would someone lock themselves inside a room in their own house? And outside, things looked even stranger. Huge metal chains were bolted to the walls, long and heavy as if they'd once been used to restrain enormous guard dogs. The Shermans looked at each other. This wasn't just eccentricity. Whoever had lived here before them had been afraid. Terrified even. But afraid of what? Oh, and it got worse. Buried in the paperwork of their contract was a really bizarre clause. The Shermans were forbidden to dig anywhere on the land without the permission of the previous owners. Who on earth sells a ranch but still controls whether or not you can put a shovel in the ground? What were they so desperate to hide beneath the soil? The Shermans couldn't answer these questions, so they brushed them aside. Maybe the previous owners had been paranoid. Maybe they'd had enemies. Maybe it was all just over-preparation. If that had been me, I'd probably been asking more questions of the previous owners. I mean, this shit is not normal. But with their 2 kids and Terry's father in tow, the Shermans moved in. And almost immediately, the ranch began to show its true nature. On a late spring afternoon, the first major event happened. An encounter that would set the tone for everything that followed. The family had invited some more family members over to help with the move, offloading boxes and furniture from the vans, etc. They were all gathered near a corral where their calves were penned. The sky was overcast and the air was cool. All in all, it was a pretty normal day on the ranch. And then, Terry noticed some peculiar movement across the pasture. It was an animal. At first glance, it looked like a wolf. Big, grey, and moving steadily towards them. Terry froze. Wolves hadn't been seen in this part of Utah for over 50 years. Could it really be? As the creature drew closer, Terry's shock deepened. This was no ordinary wolf. It was like freakishly enormous, more like the size of a black bear. By the time it had reached the corral, the animal stood chest high on Terry and his father. Now, both of these men are well over 6 feet tall. They aren't short men by any means. That meant the wolf was nearly 7 feet long from nose to tail. We're talking Game of Thrones direwolves. Its head was massive and broad, its jaws were wide, and its muscles, they rippled beneath its thick coat like a bodybuilder prepping for a competition. But its most distinguishing feature were its eyes. They were piercing, icy blue, and intelligent. The wolf walked calmly up to the family, completely unafraid. Its demeanour was almost friendly. The Sherman's children, astonished, reached out and stroked the animal's fur. It stood there patiently, as if it were a tame pet. For a moment, the fear faded and everyone relaxed. However, the wolf quickly diverted its focus to the cattle pen, where there were a few adult cows, but also some young calves. At first, the wolf just appeared to be curious. It nonchalantly strutted over to the pen, sniffing the area, as wolves do. But then, rather naively, one of the young calves popped its head through a hole in the fence, and in a flash, the wolf lunged. It clamped its massive jaws around the head of a calf inside the corral, trying to drag the screaming animal through the bars. Terry and his father sprang into action. They grabbed sticks, bricks, anything within reach, and began beating and yelling at the wolf. But the wolf didn't even react, didn't move, didn't even flinch. Desperate, Terry shouted for his son to grab his revolver. Just minutes later, with the .357 Magnum in his hand, Terry raised the gun and fired a shot into the wolf's side. The shot cracked through the air. The bullet struck point blank, and the wolf didn't move. No blood, no stagger, nothing. It was as if the bullet had bounced straight off it. Terry fired again and again. Still nothing. It was like that wolf was so fixated on mauling that poor defenceless calf, he was completely unfazed. The shots didn't even register. But eventually the animal released its grip and turned to face Terry. Its blue, icy eyes locked onto him. Calm, unbothered, almost mocking. Terry was completely gobsmacked. I mean, there aren't many animals that could survive a shot from a .357 Magnum at point-blank range. But this beast wasn't even fazed. Terry dropped the revolver and sprinted to his truck. He pulled out his rifle. This was a weapon powerful enough to drop a 1,000-pound elk. He raised the rifle, aimed at the wolf, and fired. This time a chunk of flesh tore from the wolf's body. Terry saw it rip free, dropping to the ground. But even then, the wolf didn't cry out, didn't bleed, didn't run. There was something really unnerving about the way the wolf stood there, watching the cow pen. It was almost as if it was contemplating having another go at the calf. Instead, it turned its gaze towards the family again, and simply stared at Terry one last time with a look that kind of said, "Is that the best you've got?" Then the wolf trotted off into the distance. The Shermans gave chase. They followed its massive paw prints across the soft, muddy earth for nearly a mile. The tracks were clear, they were distinct, and very easy to follow. And then, they just stopped. It didn't make sense. There was nowhere the wolf could have jumped to. It was like it took one last step and then completely disappeared. It was just gone. The ground wasn't rocky, it wasn't hard. There was no reason for the tracks to vanish. It was as if this massive wolf had simply lifted off the earth and disappeared into thin air. The family returned to the corral in shock and disbelief. The calf was badly injured, but it was still alive, just about. Near the spot where Terry had hit the wolf with the rifle, they found a piece of flesh he had blown away. They examined the chunk of flesh, and what they saw made their blood run cold. It was rotten, and it smelled absolutely putrid, as if it had been dead for days. How could that be? How could a living animal lose fresh flesh and have that flesh already be decayed? What exactly had they just seen? Why were bullets useless against this beast? And what could explain an animal simply vanishing into thin air? Back at the house, the fortified doors and windows, the deadbolts on every room suddenly made sense. The previous owners hadn't been paranoid. They'd been preparing. But preparing for what exactly? The Shermans didn't know yet. But the wolf was only the beginning. After the wolf encounter, the Shermans tried to convince themselves it was just some kind of freak event. A bizarre day, and a cool story they'd one day tell as a family. But the wolf incident was only the beginning. The creepy events at Skinwalker Ranch were just getting started. Because within days the property itself seemed to come alive, and it began to play with them. Initially, it was just small things. Terry would be out repairing fences and digging large holes to place some new fence posts. Now, if you've ever dug fence posts, you know it's a really physical process. So after a few hours, Terry was getting tired and decided to take a break and grab some lunch. He set down his tools and went inside. But when he returned to his work, his post digger that he'd just been using was now gone. At first, he thought maybe he was distracted, maybe he'd set it somewhere else. He went back inside, tired, annoyed, and confused, demanding to know if anyone had moved his post digger. But everyone denied knowing anything about the whereabouts of the digger. In fact, nobody else had been outside at all. So, Terry went back outside to search for the digger. He was now starting to question his sanity. He was searching and searching high and low for the damn thing. And that's when he spotted something really strange. Not just strange, but practically impossible. This 70-pound post-hole digger, a piece of equipment so heavy Terry had to strain to lift, was now 20 feet up in the air in a cottonwood tree, perfectly balanced on a branch. How in the bluest of blue hells does a 70-pound tool end up in a tree? Who or what put it up there? And why? The Shermans searched for rational answers. Maybe neighbours were playing pranks. Maybe the kids were messing around. But there's no way the kids could lift that post-hole digger, and the nearest neighbour was miles away. It just didn't make any sense at all. They tried to find rational explanations, but there just weren't any. Something else was happening, and it wasn't confined to the outdoors. One afternoon, Gwen drove into town for some groceries. She came back home, carried the bags inside, and began unpacking. She placed the cereal in the cupboard, the milk in the fridge, the cans on the shelves. Everything neat. Everything properly in its place. Satisfied, she stepped out of the kitchen for a moment, but when she returned, every single item was back in the bags, as though she had never even touched them. Who does that? What force takes the time to repack groceries? At this point, much like Terry with his post digger, Gwen was kind of doubting herself. Was she losing her mind? She knew that she had put the shopping away. She could visually recount looking at certain items as she placed them in the cupboards. She was even checking the expiry dates on the cereals. But then, the pranks turned personal. Later that evening, Gwen went to take a shower. She turned the shower on and waited for it to get hot while she went to grab a towel from the airing cupboard. She hung the towel on the hook just outside the shower and proceeded to step inside and take a shower. When she was finished, she reached her hand around the shower screen to grab the towel. But to Gwen's surprise, she couldn't feel the towel. She gave a little huff, then popped her head around so she could look to see if the towel had dropped to the floor. But it hadn't. It wasn't there at all. It was gone. Now, Gwen knew she had locked the door to the bathroom, so it wasn't like anyone could have come in and taken the towel for some strange reason. I don't know why anyone would have done that anyway. But she was like totally confused. She knew she had hung that towel on the hook. It was like the grocery bag situation all over again. Confused, annoyed, and dripping wet, she searched and searched, and eventually just decided to grab another towel from the cupboard. She dried herself off, did her hair, and then decided to go to the kitchen to make herself a coffee. As she turned the corner into the kitchen, she gasped at what she saw. There, neatly folded on the kitchen counter, was the towel. Now the kitchen was on the other side of the house to the bathroom, so she knew she hadn't placed it there. Had someone been in the bathroom with her? Had someone walked silently past, towel in hand, and placed it somewhere she would never expect? That very question was chilling. But if that was true, It meant they weren't alone in the house. But even then, this was impossible. She remembered locking the door and hanging the towel on the hook. So now Gwen was really starting to doubt her own sanity. First the groceries, and now the towel. Was she losing her mind? She was really starting to question her mental health at this point. As unnerving as the indoor games were, the skies above the ranch brought even more terrifying sights. It began one evening at dusk, when Terry, his son, and his nephew noticed headlights moving across one of the fields in the distance, inside the property's boundary. White lights in front, red lights in the back. It looked like a typical vehicle, you might think. Now Terry would say that he'd seen similar lights on the property before and presumed someone had taken a wrong turn. But now he was starting to believe that they were here with intent, with a purpose, so to speak. Initially, the object looked like a large RV. Terry cursed under his breath. Fucking trespassers. He grabbed a flashlight and started across the field accompanied by the two boys in an attempt to ward off the unwelcome visitors. But as the trio approached, something impossible happened. The vehicle began to move away from them, and then it started to rise. Silently, effortlessly, and unnaturally. It was unlike anything Terry had ever witnessed. Within seconds, it was hovering 50 feet above the ground. Terry froze in complete disbelief. This wasn't an RV. It sure as hell wasn't a plane. In fact, he later described it as looking more like a flying refrigerator. That might sound totally insane, but that's how he described it. And then, without a sound, it tilted and shot into the sky, gone in an instant. And after that, the skies above the ranch were never the same. Glowing spheres began to appear with terrifying regularity, some yellow, some red, some a brilliant pulsing blue. They would hover low above the pastures, dart between trees or float silently over the cattle pens. Sometimes they seemed playful, other times they seemed menacing. Through a scope, Terry swore he saw smaller crafts zipping in and out of the glowing orbs, like planes docking in a hangar. And one night, the phenomena went even further. It was deep into the autumn when something strange began happening on the ranch. Small glowing lights appeared across the property, at first fleeting, but soon they became a regular occurrence. And it was right around this time that Terry started bringing in his prize cattle. Expensive Simmental and Angus. Big money animals. That's when the activity escalated. Winter hit. Brutal snowstorms were battering the ranch. Terry found himself out all hours of the night, scouring the property for cattle that had gotten lost or wandered too far. But one night he set out to find a particular single missing Angus cow. And what he found, or rather what he didn't find, nearly broke him. He readied his horse and rode into a dense patch of woodlands at the southwest edge of the property. In the deep snow, it was easy to spot the hoof prints. Terry was freezing. This weather was brutal, so he knew he couldn't be out there for too long. Finally, he thought he was close. But as he studied the tracks, something clicked. The hoof prints were further apart than they should have been. This cow hadn't been walking or trotting. It had been running at full speed. And in a snowstorm, that just didn't make sense. Unless he was being chased by something. But what? He followed the tracks into a clearing. They went straight into the open space. And then they just stopped. No cow, no body, no blood, just nothing. A cold chill ran down Terry's spine when he had flashbacks of what had happened months earlier with the giant wolf. Once again, the prints stopped abruptly as if it had been lifted straight off the ground. Terry was thinking, this is just insane. This can't be real. How is this happening and why? Over the next few months, things only got worse. 4 more of his prize animals would vanish the exact same way, gone with no logical explanation whatsoever. And for a man whose entire life revolved around his cattle, this wasn't just financially devastating, it was personal. By the end of that brutal winter, after losing several of his prized cattle, Terry Sherman was unravelling. He was exhausted, angry, and completely paranoid. Almost every night Terry would stalk around his own property with a rifle in his hands, hiding behind bushes, crouching behind fences, hoping to finally catch whatever it was that was tormenting his family. And one night, he did. He crouched down near a thicket of shrubs when out the corner of his eye he noticed something moving in the trees. At first, it looked just like a mass, a shape, but as his eyes adjusted, Terry realised he was looking at something hovering about 20 feet above the ground. He would later describe it as almost looking like a miniature stealth bomber. Jet black, no sound, just floating there. And beneath it, multicoloured lights sweeping across the ground, like it was scanning or something. Terry froze. He barely breathed. He shifted just slightly to get a better look. His boot made contact with the brush with the faintest of sounds, and instantly the lights shut off. The craft turned, and now it was facing him. Terry didn't need to hear anything. He could feel it. It knew he was there. Terrified, he wondered, is this the thing that's been taking my cattle? Is it about to take me? The silence stretched. Seconds felt like hours. And then, without warning, the object tilted and zipped away into the night. Terry was left crouched in the dirt, shaking, staring at the empty tree line, knowing that whatever this thing was, it had been watching him all along. By now, the Shermans were living in a nightmare. Objects vanishing and reappearing, groceries unpacking themselves, towels stolen mid-shower, glowing orbs floating across their fields, portals opening in the night sky, figures watching from the shadows. The message was chillingly clear. Something intelligent was at the ranch, and it wasn't hiding anymore. But the Shermans hadn't seen the worst yet, because next, whatever was at the ranch would go after their animals. And when it did, the terror turned violent. The Shermans could live with the tricks. They could deal with tools vanishing and then reappearing in trees. Groceries re-emerging in bags after being unpacked, even wolves that shrugged off bullets. But when these entities, or whatever they were, turned on their animals, the very creatures their livelihoods depended on, the nightmare became unbearable. It began quietly. One morning, Terry went out to check his herd. In the distance, he saw one of his prize cows lying motionless in the pasture. At first, he thought it had died of natural causes. But as he approached and he could see the animal a bit more clearly, his stomach twisted. I mean, what he saw made him physically want to vomit. The cow's ear was missing. Not torn, not ripped like it had been bitten off by a predator. Its ear had been cut away with clean, surgical precision. Flesh carved out around its eye socket. And the jawbone had been stripped bare. But the strangest thing of all, there was no blood. None in the grass, none on the hide. It was as if the animal had been drained dry. Predators don't do that. Predators leave blood. They leave mess. So who or what had done this? But it didn't end there. The mutilations continued. Again and again the Shermans found cattle dead in the fields. Some missing tongues. Others missing reproductive organs. But one thing always remained consistent. In every case, the cuts were impossibly clean and precise, as though done with a surgeon's scalpel. And yet there were never any footprints, never tire marks, never any sign of human involvement, no evidence that anyone had ever even been there. Just silence. And mutilated cattle. Now each of these animals was worth thousands of dollars to Terry. For a ranching family, this was devastating. It was their income, their livelihood. But for Terry, the financial loss wasn't the worst part. It was the way it was done. The sheer strangeness, the mystery of it all, not to mention the brutality. One cow was found with its rectum cored out in a perfect circle. Another had its flesh peeled back so neatly, Terry swore it looked like something out of a medical dissection. And every time, no blood. Not a single drop. How is that even possible? Where did the blood go? Sometimes there weren't mutilations, there were vanishings. On more than one occasion, Terry followed huge animal tracks in the snow, larger than any wolf or coyote should have made. He'd follow them across open fields, heart pounding, rifle in hand. And then the tracks would just stop. Not fade, not turn, not vanish into rock, just end. As if whatever had made them lifted straight up into the air. Where had it gone? And how could something so massive simply disappear? Back inside the house, things were getting worse. Almost every night, the family reported seeing figures, humanoid shapes walking slowly around the property. They had no expression, no emotions, just a dark, ominous presence. Sometimes they would come right up to the windows. The Shermans would hear the faint tapping of fingers on the glass, and when they looked, the figures pressed their hands against the windows staring in. But there were no faces, no eyes, just blank. That sounds absolutely fucking terrifying. The family kept the blinds down, deadbolts locked. But it didn't matter. The rapping at the glass continued. And outside, in the darkness, Terry and Gwen could hear voices. Low, guttural, a language they couldn't understand. Conversations happening just feet from where they were trying to sleep. And it became constant. Terry's children began falling behind in school. Exhausted, unable to focus, Gwen, his wife, lost her job at the bank. She was delusional from lack of sleep. The family was completely unravelling. One night, Terry, armed with his rifle, sat on the porch, beaten down, disheartened, and on edge. He stared out at the horizon, watching the familiar lights he'd grown accustomed to. The darting blue orbs, the silent black fighter jet craft that skimmed the tree line. But that night, there was something new. A light, not blue, not white, but a deep, burning orange, hovering, pulsing just behind the property line. And in that moment, Terry knew something different had arrived. By this point, Terry was broken, weeks without sleep, livestock gone, strange entities at his windows every night. He sat on his porch one evening, rifle across his lap, just watching. Terry raised his rifle, peered through the high-powered scope and zoomed in all the way. What he saw didn't make any sense. The orb wasn't solid. It was like oval-shaped, almost like a doorway, and inside, it wasn't night. Inside this glowing orange oval, Terry could see blue sky. Clear as day, like he was looking through a window into another world. And then he saw movement. A figure, jet black, crawling out of the orb. Its movements unnatural, stiff, almost insect-like. Terry would later compare it to that scene from The Ring where the girl climbs out of the well, bending, twitching, pulling itself through. One by one, these black, faceless entities pulled themselves out of the glowing portal, dropped onto the ground, and then scurried into the tree line. The same figures that had been staring through his windows at night. And it wasn't just them. Terry swore he saw crafts, small, dark shapes, slip through the opening as well. He kept watching, horrified, until finally the orange glow began to shrink. The blue sky faded, and in seconds, the portal closed and the darkness returned to the ranch. It was late one evening when Terry's dogs began barking furiously near the tree line. Their hackles were raised, their eyes were fixed on something glowing in the distance. A blue orb. Now Terry would make a point of saying, of all the things they encountered at Skinwalker Ranch, these blue orbs were the scariest. And when you consider some of the things they've seen, that just speaks volumes of the terror that these blue orbs must have imposed on the family. In fact, Terry would say that the very presence of these blue orbs induced a feeling of extreme anxiety and dread. He couldn't explain exactly how or why they made him feel that way, but as soon as the orbs backed away, the feeling would lift. So, the blue orbs hovered low, pulsing, drifting back and forth as if provoking the dogs. But the dogs couldn't resist. They wanted to defend their property. So with snarls, growls and high-pitched barks, they tore free and charged into the trees. Terry shouted after the dogs, frantically trying to call them back, but they were gone. But as the dogs chased the orbs seemed to back away and retreat, so Terry felt a huge wave of relief, thinking that he had scored a victory over the orbs. The barking faded into the distance as the dogs chased the orbs out of sight. But then, just as the barking had completely faded away, the silence was disturbed by the brutal sound of visceral yelps and screams. This went on for a few seconds before it stopped abruptly and fell to complete silence. It kind of reminds me of that scene in Game of Thrones. You know, towards the end, the big war between the living and the dead, and all the Dothraki run off into the darkness with their swords on fire, and then all of a sudden the fires start to extinguish and everything falls silent. I should probably stop with the Game of Thrones analogies. Anyway, after hearing this, Terry admitted that it really shook him. He was terrified and decided the best course of action was to take his family back inside the property, lock all the doors, and investigate in the morning. So the family stayed inside the house the rest of the night in relative silence. I mean, they were all really disturbed by what they'd just witnessed happen to their dogs. At dawn, Terry put on his coat and boots, grabbed his rifle, and ventured into the woods. What he found was worse than anything he could possibly have imagined. The ground was scorched black, and in the centre of the burn marks were the remains of his 3 dogs. Nothing more than greasy, charred lumps of flesh. No blood, no bones, no recognisable features, just ash and blackened tissue. The blue orb was gone, but the message was clear. These lights weren't just curiosities, they were predators. And they had made their point. Stay away. By now, the Shermans were completely broken. They'd invested everything into this ranch. It was supposed to be their dream. But instead, it had become a waking nightmare. Every day brought new horrors. Cows dead without explanation. Tracks that ended mid-field. Orbs taunting them from the tree line. And always that feeling of being watched. Terry tried to keep it together, but each mutilation chipped away at his resolve. Gwen admitted she couldn't sleep without the lights on. The children were terrified to be outside alone. And even the fortified doors and windows, all those deadbolts the previous owners had left, didn't feel like enough anymore. Because whatever was stalking them, it wasn't kept out by locks. The Shermans had tried to fight it. They tried to ignore it. They tried to carry on. But it was clear now. The ranch, or whatever was there, didn't want the Shermans there. And soon it would force them out. By 1996, the Shermans had reached breaking point. They tried everything. Deadbolts, rifles, floodlights. But the mutilations continued. The lights kept coming. And with the loss of their dogs, the message had been delivered loud and clear. The ranch wanted them gone. So, Terry made a decision. He sold the ranch, but not to just anyone. The buyer was a man called Robert Bigelow, a Las Vegas hotel magnate with deep pockets and a very peculiar hobby. Bigelow had long been fascinated with UFOs and the paranormal. Unlike most enthusiasts, though, he had millions of dollars to spend on his curiosity. So, when he heard about the Shermans' ordeal, he didn't hesitate. He bought the ranch outright and immediately transformed it into something new. A laboratory. Bigelow assembled a team of scientists, physicists, veterinarians, and even former military personnel. They called themselves the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS for short. Their mission? Investigate the strange phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch with rigorous scientific methods. Before Robert Bigelow even bought Skinwalker Ranch, he was already assembling his team. But here's the interesting part. He didn't want ghost hunters. He didn't want believers. He went after skeptics, PhDs, hard-nosed scientists who rolled their eyes at words like paranormal. Because Bigelow knew, if he was to prove that this place was real, he needed ironclad credibility. So, this team moves in. And right away, they start with the basics. Were the Shermans hallucinating? Could mold spores in the area cause visions? And for that entire first year, not much happened. Maybe a strange light here and there, but nothing like the chaos the Shermans had been describing. Still, after months of testing, the scientists came to a chilling conclusion. This wasn't hallucinations. It wasn't poisoned water. It wasn't mass delusion. Whatever was happening at Skinwalker Ranch was real. They just had no idea what it was. One day, Terry and Gwen Sherman were tagging newborn calves. They placed a bright yellow tag in one of the calf's ears and then moved on. For about 40 minutes, their attention was on the other animals. The calf was fine. Everything was normal. And then their dog began growling. Low, focused. It was staring towards the exact spot where that calf had been. Terry and Gwen turned, walked over, and froze. The calf was gone. Well, most of it anyway. What was left behind was an absolute horror show. Its legs and head were still there, but the body had been completely surgically dissected. And yet again there was no blood, no signs of struggle, and the ear with the brand new yellow tag, gone. Terrified, they called the NIDS team. A veterinarian examined the remains and said the cuts were so precise it looked like something done on an operating table by a trained surgeon. Not an animal, not a predator, something intelligent. The team launched a full search of the property, and that is when things got worse. At each observation post, the guard dogs were all pressed to the back of their cages, whimpering, terrified, all of them staring in the same direction, the tree line. The group advanced towards the tree line, and then Terry whispered, "I see something." Perched on a tree limb was a massive wolf-like creature, hulking, humanoid, and everyone saw it and everyone froze. Terry raised his rifle and fired. The thing leapt from the tree and vanished into the woods. The team fanned out, searching desperately. They found a huge set of clawed footprints. They smelled a foul, musky stench, the same smell Terry remembered from the first day he moved onto the ranch, when that giant wolf had walked right up to him. But the creature itself was gone. Over the following weeks, the dogs refused to leave their kennels. They cowered constantly as if they were being hunted. The scientists had tracks, eyewitness testimony, and the remains of a surgically dissected calf. But they still had no explanation. How does something that big just disappear? One afternoon, Terry and Gwen were driving across the ranch to check fences and tag calves. As they passed the corral, they saw 4 of their prize bulls standing inside. These were million-dollar animals, the pride of their herd. Terry made a mental note. 4 bulls safe in the corral, locked up tight. They continued on, spent about half an hour working on the far side of the property, and then circled back. As they rounded the bend and the corral came into view, Terry stopped the truck. Them bulls were gone. Panicked, they jumped out, sprinted to the corral, but the gates were still locked. No tracks, no signs of struggle. The animals had simply vanished. Terrified, Terry scanned the area, and then, for some reason, his eyes locked on an old livestock trailer sitting nearby. It was small, rusted, and wired shut. It hadn't been used for years, but something was pulling Terry towards that trailer. He ran over, peered through the dusty window, and his jaw dropped. Inside were the 4 bulls, packed shoulder to shoulder in a space barely large enough for one. But instead of panicking, instead of crushing each other in a frenzy, they stood completely still, calm, silent, eyes glazed, like they were in some sort of trance. Terry shouted for Gwen, and in that moment, his voice seemed to break the spell. The bulls suddenly erupted, thrashing and kicking wildly, nearly tearing the trailer apart. It took hours to corral them back into their pen, but they were alive and unharmed, which left the bigger question. How had they all gotten in there? The trailer was still wired shut, cobwebs around the latch undisturbed. The space was just too small. Moving even 1 bull inside would have taken hours, but moving 4 was just impossible, unless something else had put them in there. When the NIDS researchers arrived, they were just as stunned. They examined the corral and discovered something even stranger. A section of the steel bars was magnetized. The metal compass needle stuck to it, swinging unnaturally. At the same time, two researchers on the outskirts of the property noticed something truly bizarre. Their compasses both began pulling away from true north, pointing towards the exact same invisible spot. And then came that smell. The foul, metallic, rotting stench. The same smell people reported whenever the giant wolf-like creature appeared. Both men said they suddenly felt watched. The smell grew stronger. The compasses locked in place, and then, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. The smell disappeared, the compasses corrected, and the sense of dread lifted. But for the team, the message was clear. Whatever intelligence was on the ranch wasn't just tormenting the family, it was playing with the scientists too. One of the most terrifying of all the paranormal occurrences that happened at Skinwalker Ranch happened at the very end of 1997. One night, several investigators were patrolling the property. Through night vision goggles, one of them spotted something hovering in the darkness. A glowing orange orb suspended silently above a field. At first, it was just light, but then the light began to change. It elongated. A hole appeared in its center. The investigator blinked in disbelief. He wasn't looking at just an orb. He was looking through a window. And inside that hole, he swore he saw another sky. Much like Terry had described earlier. Not Utah's night sky, but a deep, vivid blue sky, as if it were daylight in some other place. And then, movement. Again, something was crawling out of that hole. A large humanoid figure, black and solid, pulled itself through the glowing slit and dropped into the field below. Then, the orb snapped shut and darkness swallowed the field. By the time the team rushed forward, the figure was gone. But in the soil, they found deep, heavy footprints, evidence that something massive had been standing there only moments before. Had they really just watched a being enter our world from somewhere else? Determined to capture proof, the NIDS team set up a grid of cameras across the ranch. High-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art equipment. But the phenomena seemed to know. It was aware. One morning they discovered that a camera had been completely dismantled. The wires ripped out, the casing torn apart. They checked the footage from another camera that had been pointing directly at it. And what did it show? You guessed it, nothing. No intruder, no animal, no figure in the night. The equipment had been sabotaged, but invisibly. Again and again this happened. Cameras malfunctioned, wires were yanked out, batteries drained, as if the ranch was actively resisting being recorded. One evening, an investigator was walking the property when suddenly he felt eyes on him. He turned his flashlight towards the tree line and froze. High up in the branches of a tree, two enormous yellow eyes glowed back at him. The shape around them was massive, crouched low and silent. Whatever it was easily the size of a bear. But it wasn't moving and it wasn't blinking. It was just watching. Heart pounding, the investigator raised his rifle and fired. And the figure vanished. When the team rushed over to the tree, all they found were deep claw marks gouged into the bark and enormous tracks in the snow below. Whatever it was had been real, tangible, and then gone. The longer NIDS stayed, the more bizarre the activity became. Sometimes it was frightening, other times almost mocking. One investigator swore that something rifled through his car while he was standing just feet away. Another reported a sudden wave of dread so overwhelming he thought he was dying. Animals still turned up mutilated. Orbs still danced across the fields. But the strangest part, the activity always seemed to anticipate them. If the team set up cameras in one field, the lights would appear in another. If they brought extra personnel, the ranch would go quiet. When they relaxed and let their guard down, activity spiked. It was as if the intelligence behind Skinwalker Ranch wasn't just aware of being observed, It was toying with the observers. And through it all, the scientists grew more and more frustrated. Because despite the mutilations, the lights, the portals, the creatures, they couldn't get definitive proof. They had evidence, they had testimonies, they had scars, but proof? No. The phenomena seemed to always stay one step ahead, and by the early 2000s, the NIDS team was exhausted. After years of chasing shadows, they quietly withdrew. Bigelow kept the property, but the scientists were gone. The ranch, it seemed, had beaten them. But just when it seemed the mystery might fade into silence, something even stranger happened. Because, far away from Utah, in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., the US government had taken notice. And soon, Skinwalker Ranch would become part of a secret Pentagon project. After NIDS pulled out in the early 2000s, you might think Skinwalker Ranch would finally go quiet. But it didn't. It simply changed its audience. Now, instead of teams of scientists and Pentagon contractors, it was the security guards, caretakers, and ordinary ranchers in the basin who were left to deal with it. And the stories they tell are some of the most chilling of all. In 2005, a man called Ricky was hired as a night security guard on the ranch. During his interview, the supervisor casually warned him strange things might happen during your shift. Don't be alarmed. Ricky laughed it off. Ghost stories, marketing hype, just to keep the outsiders away. He didn't believe a word. And for years, nothing unusual happened. He became convinced the whole legend was just fake. But then, one cool autumn night in 2010, that changed. At 9:15 p.m, Ricky was finishing a routine patrol when he looked up. Floating high above the ranch were glowing orbs, blue and green, pulsating in rhythm. They weren't moving randomly, they were synchronized, like they were choreographed. Then, right in front of him, one orb split cleanly into two smaller orbs. They drifted apart, then zipped back together in perfect unison. Ricky was trained to identify aircraft, planes, helicopters, drones. The ranch sat under multiple flight paths. But this was like nothing he'd ever seen. He raised his phone, hands shaking trying to record. The lights flickered, pulsed, and in that moment, he swore they were watching him. Almost like they knew he was watching them. And then, gone. 1 second they were there, then the next, they simply blinked out of existence. The desert fell silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Only Ricky's ragged breath, like he'd been holding it underwater. When he checked the cameras, they'd captured nothing. His footage? Blurry, faint dots. Almost like the ranch itself refused to be recorded. Ricky had started as a skeptic, but now he wasn't so sure. Years later, another man called John decided to take the legend head on. Unlike tourists who snapped photos during the day, John wanted to spend the night alone. So, he hiked deep into the woods, built a fire, and sat back, waiting. Hours passed by, and the desert grew quiet. And then, footsteps. John froze, staring at the tree line. A figure was moving between the trees, watching him. The figure stepped closer. In the firelight, John could see it wasn't human. Its body was shimmering like liquid trying to hold solid form. It glided into view, then, before his eyes, melted back into the darkness, like ink dissolving in water. That night, John lay frozen in his tent, clutching a flashlight until dawn. He didn't sleep. He didn't dare. And when the sun rose, the figure was gone. No tracks, no sound, nothing. But John knew what he'd seen. And disturbingly, others have reported the exact same liquid-like figure watching silently from the trees. For a time, the ranch sat in limbo. Bigelow sold it off in 2016 to Brandon Fugel, a wealthy Utah real estate tycoon. At first, Fugel stayed anonymous. Nobody knew who the owner was. But when he finally stepped forward, his goals became clear. Unlike Bigelow, Fugel didn't want to keep Skinwalker Ranch in the shadows. He wanted to expose it. So he poured money into the property. A state-of-the-art command centre, radar, drones, ground sensors, radiation detectors, hundreds of cameras pointing in every direction. If the ranch was going to fight back, Vogel was going to be ready, and almost immediately, the activity returned. One investigator collapsed suddenly while working on the property. Doctors later said it looked as if his brain had been exposed to extreme radiation, but no source could be found. On another occasion, the team tracked a massive, solid object on radar, hovering directly above the ranch. It was the size of a commercial jet. They sprinted outside, scanning the skies, but could see nothing. The object was gone. The cattle mutilations too have continued. In one infamous case, a prized cow was found dead in the middle of a field on a perfectly clear day. Within minutes of its collapse, the team reached it. No blood, no tracks, no signs of predators, and strangest of all, the rest of the herd, normally clustered together, had huddled in the furthest corner of the pasture, trembling in fear. What had killed that animal? What had the others seen? Even in recent years, the shadows of Skinwalker Ranch have grown darker. Researchers describe sudden spikes of radiation that vanishes just seconds later. Cameras capture glowing spheres that dart out of frame. Investigators hear footsteps in empty hallways or see shadowy figures lurking on the edges of the fields. And the sensation of being watched, the same dread that drove the Shermans away, still hangs heavy over the property. It's as if the ranch itself is alive, breathing, waiting. So, what is Skinwalker Ranch? Is it a hotspot for UFOs? A thin place where our world brushes against another? Is it some kind of experimental playground where an intelligence beyond our own comprehension manipulates cattle, machines, and even people like pieces on a chessboard? Or is it something darker, something ancient? The Navajo once spoke of skinwalkers, witches who could shift into animals and wielded dark powers and sowed terror. Was the ranch named in their honor, or as a warning? For nearly 30 years, scientists, ranchers, and even the US government have tried to answer these questions. But the truth is, Skinwalker Ranch gives up nothing. It teases, it terrifies, it shows just enough to keep you coming back. And then it slams the door shut. Today, Skinwalker Ranch still sits in the Utah desert. The cameras are still rolling, the scientists are still watching, and the phenomena still goes unsolved. I really hope you enjoyed that deep dive into the mysteries of the Skinwalker Ranch. For more stories of hauntings, click this video here. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul.